Proof under the sand, the single point of failure. To see the choke point, stand where the rock starts moving. 100 kilometers inland, the Bou Craa pit looks like a sunburned bowl. Trucks crawl up switchbacks and dump ore onto a steel throat that never sleeps, the world's longest conveyor. It runs like a horizon line toward Layun, feeding stockpiles that feed ships. That belt is not a symbol, it's the metronome. When it stutters, procurement calendars from Mumbai to Mato Grosso lose their beat by days that turn to weeks. Follow the ore. At Geopolitics, the river of rock hits chemistry. Sulfur burns to make sulfuric acid, acid eats rock to free phosphoric acid meets ammonia to become DAP and MAP. Every tank, line, scrubber and stack is a gate you can't skip. If a converter trips or a flare goes cold, a contract slips. Plant managers watch dashboards that blend metallurgy and weather. Off-spec acid today means barges idle tomorrow. You feel it when offers disappear from trader inboxes before lunch. Here's the catch most people miss. Not all rock is equal, and not all buyers can wait. Cadmium is the quiet bouncer at the door. Europe capped it tightly. Infant formula plants and mills with strict residue limits follow suit. Morocco's investment in beneficiation, selective mining, and process control lets it clear those bars reliably. Others can blend, but blending is an art that costs time you don't have when planting windows close. In practice, available phosphate splits into usable now and usable if you can dilute and persuade a regulator. Guess which bucket feeds cities? Meanwhile, reality doesn't sit still. Every year, average ore grades decline a hair. Slightly more rock to move per ton of P, slightly more acid per ton, slightly more gypsum to stack by the sea. Compliance tightens on the same clock. Communities near Safi and Geopolitics point at plumes and wells, operators point at scrubbers and desal. The engineering gets better and the bar moves anyway. Costs creep, margins tighten. The system stays balanced because the belt keeps turning. Shipping compresses all of this into a single bet. Load windows at Geopolitics and Safi are finite. Swell shuts a berth. A labor dispute trims shifts. A court somewhere seizes a cargo over Western Sahara paperwork, and 2 more ships slow steam to avoid creating a queue. AIS screens glow with loitering icons. Futures screens kink upward 48 hours later. India pulls phosphoric acid into Candler to keep complex plants fed. Brazil calls dealers to confirm DAP slots before soy sowing. The ripple doesn't need months. It needs a weather front and a judge. Hold on, someone says, can't we buy elsewhere? You can for part of the curve. Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Russia, the US, and China all lift rock and sell product. China's exports ebb when domestic demand flares. Russian cargo faces sanctioned baggage and insurance friction. US rock is largely tied to internal flows with different cadmium profiles. Jordan and Egypt run hard but can't replace a Moroccan outage. On a good year, diversification softens price spikes. On a bad week, it doesn't move the needle fast enough to save a planting window in Punjab. First cracks show up where the plant meets the law. A minor dip in ore quality nudges cadmium toward a customer's internal red line. QA slows releases. Warehouses hold pallets waiting on a lab certificate. A retailer tells a co-op to split applications because product is late. Yields shrug off small cuts in good rain. In a dry year, that half dose becomes a yield hit that becomes a food price chart on a finance desk. Resilient supply on a slide turns into a queue outside a bakery. Meanwhile, sanctions and screens redraw who can buy what, where ESG clauses travel in fertilizer contracts now. Some funds won't touch cargo tied to contested mines. Others will, at a discount that masks a different risk. A court action in a distant jurisdiction that freezes a ship mid-route. Western Sahara's legal status isn't an academic question to a procurement officer with 10 school districts on one framework agreement. He buys the grade he can defend on paper and in a meeting that funnels demand back through the same gates. Here's the single point of failure wrapped in numbers. Ore quality trends down, compliance trends up. Plant uptime floats on maintenance cycles that hate surprise outages. Ports live on weather and labor. Shipping lives on insurance. Contracts live on clauses, and all of them, stacked, still depend on a belt across a desert feeding a complex on a coast. The proof isn't in theory. It's in deleted offers, rerouted ships, tighter cadmium specs, and a soy farmer turned away by a dealer who shrugs and says, sold out, no date. The human stake, lives on the conveyor. Start with a kitchen table in Cairo. Amal, who runs a mill with her brother, keeps a ledger beside the kettle. She checks her phone before dawn. Suppliers have pulled DAP offers again. Flour moves one day at a time, bread subsidies do not. She flips pages, runs a finger over last year's price, then stares at the new number she can't pass on without phone calls and apologies. Outside, a line forms earlier than usual. She knows every face. She knows which bag will be shared between 3 apartments. Meanwhile in Punjab, Harjit times phosphorus like rain. He's learned to stretch nitrogen with legumes and split doses, but phosphorus isn't flexible. When the dealer says 2 weeks, Harjit recalculates rows, trims the target yield, and phones his cousin about borrowing a spreader to make one pass count. He won't tell his father until evening. The old man still keeps the soil test cards in a tin and taps them like talismans. "The land remembers," he says softly. Harjit nods and doesn't say what the land remembers is shipments. In Lagos, Tolu coordinates a school lunch program. Fridays used to mean rice, beans, and an extra ladle of stew. After prices turned, protein dropped to once a week. She updated menus, printed new posters with cheerful colors, and told staff to smile when explaining the change. Kids don't ask why phosphorus is expensive. They ask why stew is thinner. She buys time with carrots and stories, then stares at the procurement portal at night, trying to guess which bid is real. Down the coast at Jorf Lasfa, Youssef, a fisherman, steers around the plume on windy afternoons. His father fished these waters before the stacks and tanks rose. He learned the rhythm of ships by the tugwash. Business is better when weather behaves. On some days, he sees dredgers working and tells himself it's temporary. On others, he anchors in a quiet cove and watches a line of bulkers nose toward the berths, each one a floating price tag for someone far away. A trucker named Miriam counts days by loads between the belt and the port. She knows which weighbridge breaks down after sandstorm and which dispatcher will squeeze an extra run if a ship queues. When a court case pops up on the driver chat, cargo frozen over paperwork, she shrugs and checks her fuel. She's paid by the trip, not the clause, but the clause decides whether she eats with her kids on Tuesday or Thursday. Here's the crazy part: subsidies keep the noise down until they don't. In one ministry, a civil servant signs off on a buffer to shield farmers from the latest spike. 2 quarters later, the line item runs dry. The shield vanishes overnight, exposing every household that believed the promise on the radio. In one town, a co-op meeting ends early because tempers rise. In another, the meeting runs late because nobody wants to go home without a plan. Micro-stories braid into something larger. A co-op in Mato Grosso staggers deliveries so soy growers can at least band a starter. Yields dip, feed prices rise, and a poultry processor trims shifts. A hospital kitchen in Alexandria swaps lentils for pasta 3 days a week. A baker in Casablanca changes loaf size, then changes it back after complaints, then posts a sign that says temporary. Temporary lasts longer each month. Not everyone loses. A trader closes a prepayment at a discount and buys lunch for his team. A maintenance foreman earns a bonus for keeping a converter online through a rough week. A smallholder who saved seed and composted diligently sees less pain than his neighbor, then gets a call from a cousin asking for advice. The system rewards discipline and punishes luck. To understand why the belt matters, listen to people who never see it. They repeat similar sentences in different accents. We'll manage, we'll stretch, we'll make it work. They do, until the gap between a ship's ETA and a planting window turns those sentences into silence. That's when a teacher ends class 10 minutes early to help in the kitchen. That's when a farmer walks his field and measures compromise in footsteps. That's when a miller stops the line for an hour and prays the phones ring with something other than no date. The origin story, how a desert became dinner. To understand why a windstorm over Bou Craa can thin stew in Lagos, go back to when we made a bargain with the soil. The Green Revolution didn't just bring seeds and irrigation. It brought a ledger, higher yields in exchange for steady inputs, nitrogen, potash, and phosphorus. Nitrogen could be pulled from air with energy. Potash had a broader map. Phosphorus had no substitute and a map that pointed hard toward North Africa. Geology, not policy, picked the winner long before ministries wrote plans. Colonial surveyors had marked the scene decades earlier. Spanish engineers drilled the Western Sahara and sketched a band of ore. The prize wasn't just the rock, it was the geometry. A line to the Atlantic could turn a desert basin into a shipping schedule. They drew rail links, tested routes, and eventually stretched a conveyor like a straight edge toward the sea. Ports followed the promise. When Morocco assumed control, it inherited more than a mine. It inherited a scaffold, rail, berths, and rights of way that could be thickened into an industrial spine. Meanwhile, a different map took shape farther up the coast. Djorf Lasfa was a port. OCP turned it into a chemistry city. Instead of shipping raw rock and hoping buyers had plants, they built the plant's sulfur tanks, acid lines, granulators beside the water. A slurry pipeline from Kauribga fed reactors that didn't blink at scale. The strategy was simple and ruthless: sell nutrients, not stones. It worked because the world wanted bags ready to spread, not problems to solve. Western Sahara's dispute slipped into this build-out like a sand grain in a bearing. Recognition debates, counterclaims, court orders, and occasional cargo seizures made an upstream seem a downstream calculation. Insurance clauses grew teeth. Traders learned which bills of lading sailed clean and which might meet a sheriff at berth. Morocco doubled down on legitimacy by moving value-add into the kingdom proper, anchoring jobs and chemistry on uncontested ground while the belt kept feeding ships. Legal fog stayed fog, the pipeline stayed wet. But there was one problem the maps didn't fix. Chemistry needs more than rock. Sulfur, imported by the shipload, became the quiet partner. Refineries in distant countries cleaned fuels. The yellow mountains they made became acid in Morocco, then fertilizer on a field. Water, scarce inland, arrived via Dessau on the coast. Power came from grids increasingly tied to wind and sun. The walkway from rock to bread wasn't mine, right arrow ship, right arrow field. It was mine, right arrow beneficiation, right arrow sulfuric acid, right arrow phosphoric acid, right arrow DAP map, right arrow silo, right arrow spreader. Every step added leverage and risk. The bargain sped food into cities, wheat yields rose, rice fed more people, poultry boomed as feed phosphorus kept conversion rates tight. The success wrote its own blind spot. Soil tests improved, yet budgets assumed bags would arrive because they always had. Farmers learned to trust the calendar more than the cloud. Governments learned to calm prices with subsidies instead of asking why the nozzle narrowed. We mistook reliability for inevitability. Still, discipline built resilience where it could. OCP chased low cadmium specs before Europe forced the issue, buying access later when rules tightened. Complexes learned to switch recipes when sulfur prices jumped. India inked long-term phosphoric acid agreements to tame monsoon panic. Brazil's co-ops mapped import corridors to land DAP in time for soy. The machine adapted because it had to, not because it wanted to. Now zoom into the pipes and you see the logic that made a desert dinner. Concentrate the choke points you can control, integrate the messy chemistry, guard the gates regulators care about, and let ships do the rest. The move from raw rock to finished fertilizer didn't just add margin, it created a moat. Buyers didn't just need ore, they needed acid of a certain purity, granules of a certain size, cadmium below a certain line, on a date that matched rain. The supplier who could deliver, that built the modern menu. That's the origin story. Geology drew the map, colonial rails sketched the route, a state company poured chemistry onto a coast, and the Green Revolution turned it into a covenant. We eat because that covenant holds. When it strains, the chemistry gate in grocery from rock to food. At Djorf Lasfa, the rock stops being rock. It arrives washed and sized, then meets a yellow mountain sailor's joke you can smell from offshore. Sulfur melts, burns and turns into sulfur dioxide, then sulfuric acid in towers where air and vanadium catalysts do quiet, relentless work. That acid meets ground phosphate in reactors that fizz and steam, unlocking phosphorus into a thick, dark liquor, phosphoric acid. From there, the route splits. Some acid ships as is. Most meets ammonia in granulators that spin out DAP and MAP, hard pellets, uniform, dry, ready for a spreader. Here's where it gets interesting. Each stage is a gate with rules the audience can feel: speed, purity, and timing. Beneficiation upstream trims clay and raises grade, but it can't magic away cadmium. That lives in the crystal lattice of certain ores. The only honest answers are selective mining, blending, and downstream purification. Plant managers carry cadmium charts in their heads like pilots carry wind. A batch that tests a hair high triggers rework or rerouting. Europe's limits turned those hairlines into bright lines. Morocco answered by building process control into culture. Lab techs move samples like couriers, accredited certificates of analysis travel with every lot. Waste sits on the ledger too. Every ton of phosphoric acid births several tons of phosphogypsum, stacked in white plateaus along the coast. Those stacks need liners, drainage, monitoring, and weather plans because a heavy storm can test engineering faster than permits do. Managers talk about closing the water loop. In practice, that means squeezing every liter through clarifiers and thickeners, recovering heat, and routing condensate back into the circuit. Water in a drying region becomes another reagent, counted, recycled, sometimes bought from the sea. Desal plants hum to keep chemistry honest when rainfall doesn't. Sulfur is the quiet lever. Most of the world's sulfur comes from desulfurizing oil and gas, refinery byproduct turned feedstock. When energy markets lurch, sulfur prices follow, and so do margins at acid plants. A refinery outage in one hemisphere becomes a spreadsheet headache in another. To cope, complexes carry inventories, hedge, and diversify suppliers. Still, a few missed cargoes can slow a whole line. The irony is sharp. In the name of cleaner fuels, refineries make the sulfur that feeds the crops that become biofuels. The loop didn't ask permission to be that tangled. Plant bottlenecks rarely look dramatic. A converter bed loses activity, throughput drops. A corrosion coupon flags a hot spot. A section comes down for a weld. A granulator wears out faster than forecast because a run of acid came in a shade impure. Maintenance windows stretch because a spare impeller waited too long at customs. Behind every sold out lies a maintenance planner who stared at a Gantt chart and chose the least bad week to open a flange. Quality drift rides the same rails. Trace sodium sneaks into acid, granules capillary too much moisture, and cake in bags. You fix 100 tiny variances so one farmer doesn't notice. The environmental budget is real money. Scrubbers keep fluoride and sulfur compounds out of the sky. Pond liners keep processed water from wandering. Monitoring wells ring sites like sentries. Communities near Safi and Jorf LASFA red dashboards, file complaints, and attend hearings. Operators present stack readings and water balances. Trust is a process, not a press release. It improves when the wind behaves and frays when it doesn't. What used to be externalities now sit in board decks under headings like license to operate. Meanwhile, sulfur markets have their own weather. When refineries run less sweet crude or push turnarounds, sulfur tightens. Logs fill with phone calls to traders in Dubai and Rotterdam. Morocco moved to buffer that volatility with storage and contracts, but the dependency remains. You can mine rock without sulfur. You can't make fertilizer at scale without sulfuric acid. That's why you see yellow past the berths, inventory as risk management. Here's the thing, every improvement buys resilience at the cost of complexity. On-site power from renewables steadies pumps and compressors when grids wobble. Desal frees production from rainfall but ties it to energy. Low cadmium lines win Europe but raise unit costs. Better granulation improves spreadability but demands tighter fines control. When converters run, the whole world forgets the juggling act. When one trips, the act becomes visible in a farmer's inbox. Environmental creep isn't just regulation, it's physics. Warmer seas change cooling load, wind patterns shift plume behavior, plants respond with higher stacks, better dispersion, smarter controls, water reuse ratios inch upward, gypsum stack drainage improves. The budget holds until a once-in-20 storm lands twice in 5 years. Then the site learns another lesson late at night under headlamps. Operators will tell you chemistry isn't the bottleneck, uptime is. Keep acid clean, ammonia steady, granulators happy, and the pellets flow. But they'll also tell you what nobody outside notices. Quality doesn't happen at the bag. It happens in ore selection, in sulfur tank scheduling, in the pH curve of a reactor, in a kid at a lab bench pipetting a sample right. The gate from rock to food is technical, yes, and also human. That's why a factory tour feels like walking through a scoreboard, where each number means bread somewhere. The geopolitics of a conveyor belt.